Hi, and welcome to Rose Red Homestead. This is the place where people come to learn about being more self-sufficient, how to increase their food security, and to prepare for emergencies. For instance, like we've just been through the COVID year. And so all of these things pertain to that. We would like to invite your help to help us get these videos out to a broader audience who may benefit from joining our community of people who are interested in these things. I have just learned that the YouTube algorithm works like this. So someone plugs in a search term that they would like to learn something about on YouTube. So YouTube's algorithm, and they use artificial intelligence to do quick gathering. They look for videos that have a lot of subscribers, a lot of likes, a lot of shares, and sometimes they even go into the comments to see what people are saying about them. And I didn't know that until just actually a couple of days ago. So we would invite you, if you would like to be a part of getting these videos out to a broader audience, to subscribe if you haven't yet, and click that bell so that you will be notified when a new video comes out. And then please like our videos if indeed you do like them, and then share them. For today, we're going to talk about something that has come up quite a bit on our Facebook page and also in comments on our home canning videos, and that is, why do my jars break? What can we do? And so my answer is, we can stop breaking our canning jars. So we're going to talk about the 3 conditions under which they break, and then at the end of the video, I'm actually going to demonstrate a jar breaking using one of these. So we'll get started on all of this when we come back in just a second. The first thing that we are going to look at is examples of the 3 different types of breaks that generally occur in canning. So I have marked those breaks. The interesting thing is that if you have a jar that breaks in a canner, you can actually look at the characteristics of that break, and that how the jar broke can help you identify what was the cause. So probably the most common cause of jar breakage is thermal shock, and that's when the bottom just cracks right off, and usually in a pretty big piece with maybe some smaller pieces, and then all the contents fall out, of course. Now, thermal shock occurs when there is a temperature differential between the water, the canner, the jar, or the contents of the jar. The second type of a break is a pressure break, and this happens when there is pressure develops on the inside of the jar and pushes outward against the walls of the jar. And this is a very distinctive break. Generally, there is a single crack that runs up and down the side, but it splits, it forks then, sometimes just into 2, sometimes it will continue and fork again, sometimes the forks run up this way, but you will know that you have a pressure break if this is the pattern that the cracks make in your jar. The last type is an impact break, and this is where something strikes the outside of the jar, or the inside for that matter, and then the jar fractures, and the fractures radiate away from the point of impact. So how do these form in canning during the canning process? We're now going to go through some canning principles that we all know, and then I'm going to relate them back to these 3 different breaks so that we can talk about what some things are that will happen. First of all, I did quite a bit of research in getting ready for this video today, and one of the things that I read which sort of made me chuckle was, we need to take really good care of our canning jars. For instance, if we are opening a jar of peaches, a jar of applesauce, or whatever, and we are wanting to get out that last peach or whatever, we we need to be very careful if we're using a metal spoon reaching into that jar and hitting the inside of the jar, because that can weaken the inside of the jar, and then it can cause a weak spot, which could be the point of either a pressure break or even an impact break. Not likely to be the temperature differential there for the thermal shock. The other thing that one of the places that I researched stated was, don't use your canning jars for freezing foods in the freezer. Don't use them for putting leftovers in. And I was thinking, my heavens, when I was raising my children, my kids put frogs and tadpoles and my gosh, we had praying mantis and even tarantulas in my canning jars. And then I just rinse them out and sanitize them and use them for canning again. Now, over the 60 years that I've been canning, I really have not had very much breakage. In fact, Jim and I were trying to reflect back if we'd ever had any breakage since he and I have been doing canning together, and I can't think of a time. But that doesn't mean it doesn't happen, and it happens to a lot of people, and maybe I've just been lucky, I don't know. But taking good care of our canning jars is the first thing. This is my pressure canner, and I use it for both pressure canning and water bath canning. One of the things we need to be sure to do when we are canning is to put about a ½ inch space between where the jars are sitting right here and the bottom of the canner. Never, never, never put jars in the canner where the bottom comes in contact with the bottom of the canner. Imagine the temperature differential that could be caused there, with that heat being right there, and whatever the temperature is of the food inside the jar or the jar itself. By raising it just a ½ inch, you can eliminate that problem. There's no temperature differential because water is going to get under here and form a cushion so that that doesn't happen. So that's an important thing. Now that we know that putting a rack in the bottom of the pan is important, what if you are doing, for instance, water bath canning in just one of your regular pans? I did that for years. What could we do for a rack if we don't have one that fits? Here's what I did, and I did it many times. I simply created a little array of jar lids, and that's the exact perfect amount of height, and then I just staggered my jars in the canner on those jar lids, and it works just fine as rack. Then the other thing is, headspace is terrifically important. And one of the reasons that it is because during canning, the food in the jar boils. When it boils, it gives off steam and the food expands. If we don't respect the headspace, then this kind of a break will occur. A pressure break will occur, because there's no place for that food to go except outward. And then the other thing is, with pressure breaks, to avoid them, putting the ring on way too tight, more than just finger tight. So they say just finger tight is how tight your fingers can do it without getting your wrist and your whole arm involved. Because the steam from the food, when it boils, has to get out. And it is getting out underneath this lid, whether you realize that or not. The steam pushes the lid up just a little bit and comes out of the jar and out from underneath this ring if we have only done it finger tight. Otherwise, we are going to build up pressure here and have one of these, a pressure break. Another thing is to read your canning instructions very carefully. We know from the USDA that we should not can with fewer than 3 quart jars in a big canner like this, because what happens, particularly in a water bath, that these jars in a canner that is completely filled with water, they're more buoyant because they're in water, and so they might be crashing into each other if there's extra room inside the canner and cause one of these, an impact fracture. So if you only have 4 quarts to can, and you're going to use a big canner, one of the things that you can do is fill up extra jars with water and just put those in as placeholders and then run your processing so that the jars don't have enough space to really wander around. Okay, now something that I have not been very good on, and I am trying to be better about this, is demonstrating in our canning videos appropriate headspace and to get air bubbles out. And I have demonstrated in a number of videos that I just use a table knife. And I have since my mother taught me to can when I was a preteen. And it has worked for me, and I sort of scoffed at the idea that you could take a table knife and score the inside of a jar, but several sources say that it's possible. I don't think that I've ever done it, but why take the chance? And so I am now converting over. I'm replacing my metal table knife with a plastic picnic knife. And this edge is serrated, so I'm not going to be sticking that one down in the jar, but I'm going to stick the handle side down in the jar, because I refuse to buy one of those plastic thingies that they charge for, because it's ridiculous. It's a headspace measure. Well, headspace is 1 inch, and so you bring it up to this rim, and that's 1 inch. And so then I'm just going to use this to put inside the jar, and it's not going to score the jar on the inside. Scoring the jar on the inside will make a weak spot, which will most likely create something like this. It could also cause an impact break like this. So what are the types of things that then will cause this to happen? All right, so putting it right next to on the bottom, we talked about that just a moment ago as one thing. But here's where we need to use really good common sense and understanding that the cause of breaks like this is a temperature differential. What does that mean in terms of what temperature should the jars be? What temperature should the food that we put inside be? And what temperature should the water in our canner be? If we're wanting to eliminate temperature differentials, then what we are hoping to do is to get things as close to the same temperature as possible. So if, for instance, if I'm going to be canning raw pack chicken, I have my jars at room temperature because I'm not going to do anything hot pack. I have my canner out there ready to go and the water is simmering. So I get my chicken out of the refrigerator. I put my chicken in my jar, cold chicken, room temperature jar, and then I put the jars out in my simmering water. How many temperature differentials have we just created? Many more opportunities for this thermal shock to occur. Another temperature differential can be when you pull your jars out of the canner, when they are hot and you are moving them to a place to cool. Now the recommendation is to put them in a place that is not drafty, not cold. Now I want to tell you a couple of things. When I take jars out of the canner, very often I am outside. Sometimes it is even winter time with temperatures in the 30s, even the high 20s, when I'm taking hot jars out of the canner. And if you have watched our videos when it is wintertime and there's snow on the ground out there, you notice that I just leave the jars out there to cool. And people have said, oh my gosh, they're gonna crack, they're gonna crack. Well, let me tell you a couple of things. First of all, these are hot jars that I'm taking out of the canner. Now, if I were to put the hot jars against my cold granite countertop, that is inviting the bottom to break off. So always put them on a rack. You can put them on a towel, you can put them on a breadboard, but make sure that where you are putting them, they are cushioned against cold places. And so, even though I am outside, generally the days that I select they don't have cold, icy winds. They're generally fairly calm, because here's what happens when you take a hot jar out of the canner and you set it down. People think that immediately if it's cold, if the air is 30 degrees, that cold air is going to just start hugging this jar and crack it. No, that is not what happens. Heat transfer is at work here, and heat always moves from the place where it is the hotter to a place where it is cooler. So from the moment that that jar is removed from the canner, it is giving off its heat. It's losing its heat because it heat longs for equilibrium. If it's cold out here and it's hot here, then the heat is going to go outward. If the opposite is true, then the heat is going to come inward. So the heat is being given off by the jar, every surface of the jar. And you can even test this by bringing your hands close to the jar, and you will feel it. About right here, you can feel the heat. So the jar is protected by that hot cushion of warm air. And you don't need to worry about this until pretty soon. If it's a cold day out there, I will only leave the jars out there for an hour or two until the jars are starting to cool down, and I don't want them to be 30 degrees. And so I will bring them in before they give off all of their heat. The only exception would be if it is a cold and windy day, that wind is going to come and brush away that nice warm cushion around the jar. So you may want to protect them by bringing them in the house. So we don't need to get overly concerned about it. Just use good common sense and pay attention to temperature differentials. Probably these three things will cover about 95% of all canning jar breakages. Now, I have to confess, I used to teach statistics and research to graduate students. And for my statistics students, I would often say, anytime anybody quotes statistics to you in the middle of a conversation, there's a 97.24 chance that those statistics are made up on the spot. And of course, that's a joke, because obviously I made that number up right on the spot, and I usually get a good laugh. But I'm going to kind of make up a statistic right now and tell you that from my experience and what I have seen with people reporting jar breakages to us, I would say that these three things, this is by far the most frequent occurrence, this temperature differential. But I would say that if we take a few of these little precautions and make sure that we follow good practices in canning, then that should cover about 95% of breakages. Well, what about the other 5%? Well, that's the unknown. Who knows what causes that other 5%? When you do bulk manufacture of hundreds of thousands of jars, there is a probability, of course, that there are going to be inherent weak spots in some of those jars. It happens. And sometimes we can't diagnose what a break is. And so my suggestion is, don't even worry about those that you cannot diagnose. Don't spend any time thinking about it or worrying about it. Only look at the ones. These three cover the huge number of breakages. So if you have one of these breaks, now you can diagnose it, and now you know several things in each one of these things in order to stay clear from having those jars in that kind of situation. All right, now as promised, I am going to demonstrate to you exactly what a temperature differential can do to a jar. We're going to attempt to break the bottom out of a jar so that you can see it. And I am going to get our mock chicken out of the refrigerator. Here's our mock chicken right here. It's cold packed chicken just from the refrigerator, and of course that is ice and water in there. So now we're going to take it over and put it in boiling water. Of course, I have exaggerated the conditions, so hopefully we will have a successful jar breakage, just so that you can see how that happens. So I'll meet you over at this pot. All right, here we go. Now when I put this in, it's not going to explode. You should hear a soft crack. So listen for that. Did you hear that? All right, there we have it. Temperature differential. And this is there's the bottom of the lid, the bottom just boiling and boiling. So this is generally exactly how it looks. Lots of ways to break jars. Lots of more ways how to prevent jar breakage when we know, boy, this is still cold on the top and it's hot on the bottom. So this was certainly a demonstration of temperature differential, thermal shock, and what happens to jars when there is that differential. So I hope this was useful to you. Thanks for joining us, and we will see you at our next video.